Hello there and welcome back. This is Jenna from McGuire. Sorry I've been gone from traditional videos for a bit here, but I caught a really bad virus and I was out for many days. I'm now getting back to it. I still have a funny voice, but I wanted to share with you today a handful of cards that are colorful and made with stamps and ink. I feel like there are so many great techniques and products out there that we often forget how we can do really cool things with basic, colorful inks and solid stamps. So let's go ahead and get started. I have 3 cards that are created by doing this kind of plaid background by overlapping solid stamps. This is the new Simon Says Stamp Airy Greetings stamp set. There is a coordinating die that cuts out those solid sentiment strips, but I'm not using that today. What's nice about this set is you can stamp those solid sentiment strips in whatever color you want to match your project, and then you can stamp the sentiment on top with black ink or white heat emboss, and it'll stand out nicely. This technique, though, is just using those solid stripe or sentiment strip stamps and overlapping them to create a plaid. But if you have other solid stripe stamps, you could definitely use those for this technique or any shape of solid stamp. So I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white cardstock that I'm placing into my MISTI stamping tool, and inside of that stamping tool I have the waffle flower grip mat, which also helps to hold my cardstock in place. From the stamp set, I'm grabbing those solid stripe images, and I'll create a fun plaid in each corner of my cardstock. I'm using a Simon Says Stamp A2 placement guide over my cardstock to help me make sure that I place these strips very straight on my card. So you can see how there is a grid on the placement guide, and that allows me to get this stamp straight along it. And it also holds that stamp in place until I close the door on my MISTI stamping tool to grab that image. So I'll remove the placement guide, and then I can stamp my image onto my white cardstock. I'm using Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively Saturated inks today, and I'll describe why in a moment. Once I've stamped that, I can rotate my cardstock and do the same thing on the other edge. This will give me 2 plaid images that I'll build up in the top left and the bottom right corner of my cardstock. Now I want to make several backgrounds today, so I'll go ahead and repeat that on 2 other backgrounds, so I'll have 3 in total. Once I've stamped that on all 3 backgrounds, I can take my placement guide and put it back on top of our background and move on to our next stripe. I'm using different length stripes from that same stamp set, and some of them I'm overlapping, some of them I'm kind of spacing out, just to kind of create some solid lines in each of the 2 corners on this background. By using that placement guide, I can be sure that each time they are straight, which is really helpful because sometimes I get things a little bit crooked if I don't have a placement guide like that. So this time I'm using the Cantaloupe color, which is a light orange. Notice that I double stamp. I'm a double stamper. I like to do that because it gives me more crisp results, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So I mentioned I'm using the saturated inks today. You could use any dye or pigment inks for this. The reason I chose the saturated inks, one, I really like their colors. They're kind of like fun jelly bean colors, and I wanted bright and happy today. The other is I find that I can stamp the saturated inks multiple times on top of each other without bleeding occurring. So I can stamp once for a light, stamp it again right on top for a little bit darker, and continue to stamp multiple times to make the ink image darker. Some inks might bleed a little bit with that much stamping on top of each other, but I find these work really well for it. But yes, please try whatever inks that you may have. You definitely can do this technique with others. Another reason that I like the saturated inks for this particular technique is I'm going to overlap inks. And when you overlap 2 different colors of inks, you get a new color. And I find these just really overlap well. You'll see that as we start building up these plaid corners on these cards, and you'll really see that in my next set of cards later in this video, where I have solid images overlapping to create new colors. So this is something you can do with any solid stamps. Maybe you have some solid hearts or solid circles. Try doing overlapping of inks to create more colors. It makes it look like you used a bunch of colors when really you just used a basic set and did some overlapping. So I'm continuing this process each time using the grid to make sure I'm keeping these stripes in a straight line. And I'm just kind of staggering these and overlapping some of them here and there. You can see I overlapped the yellow and the green, which gave me a little bit of a third color there. And now I'm overlapping the surf and the marine. But we're going to do even more overlapping now as we start forming that plaid. And I'll put down these same images, but put them vertically on our card. Again, I can use the grid to not only make sure my stamp is straight, but to kind of hold it in place until I close the door on my stamping tool. Another advantage of using this grid placemat or a grid like this is that you can also test your stamping on the clear grid first to make sure that you're happy with the placement, make sure you're happy with how straight it is, then go ahead and stamp it on your project and then just wipe that clear grid clean. Now, I didn't test any of these today, but it's definitely something you can do if you want to make sure you get your stamping just right. Now in this direction, I will be stamping the same colors in the same order. And then you can start to see these really cool effects where our colors are overlapping. You can see where the pink overlapped the blue, you have that beautiful kind of heather purple showing up. Where the pink overlapped the yellow, you have a bright orange showing up. And it just really makes this whole plaid effect even better. Now, I'm sorry I'm moving through some of these pretty quickly. I just wanted to save some time. And really, there is no method to how I line these up. I'm just staggering them. By staggering them, I'm making it easier on myself instead of trying to perfectly space them out, which would take a lot more effort. And notice each time I'm stamping this on all three backgrounds. After completing my plaid corners, I did decide I wanted to add a little bit of a heather purple, so I stamped that in also. And the really cool part about this is you could make multiple backgrounds at once. You're taking the time to do this, you might as well make more than one background. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways to use these 3 backgrounds for different looks. By the way, some of these inks you'll notice I had to stamp multiple times to get where I wanted. That's probably because I needed to re-ink them, but I'm feeling a little lazy and don't want to do that, so I just stamp it a few extra times. All right, so now we have our 3 backgrounds. Let's get started with the first one where I do a really cool effect with this background, and this is something you can do with pattern papers, ink blended backgrounds, anything. I'm using a new embossing folder and die combo from Simon Says Stamp called Cherry Blossom. Let's start with the embossing folder first. This is a 3D embossing folder that'll give beautiful results. I'm placing one of my inked backgrounds into the folder and running it through my die cut machine. This is a Spellbinders Platinum 6. I find that for these 3D embossing folders, I use the platform, the white B plate, a cardstock shim, and the embossing folder, and I get beautiful results. Look at that fun, detailed pattern. Now, I want the flowers to stand out along that color, so I'm using a sanding block to kind of sand away some of the raised surface. Now, I'm not sanding over all of it, just so I could have little pops of white on the edges of these flowers. And this is something that works really well if you have an ink blended background or pattern paper, something with a white core to the paper. And what's happening is I'm kind of sanding off that color on the raised areas to expose the white, which allows those flowers to stand out a bit more. I also mentioned that this embossing folder comes with dies, and these are the dies. They create cute little cherry blossoms that coordinate with the embossing folder. So what I did is I cut some from silver matte cardstock, and now I'm temporarily taping those die cuts into my embossing folder, lining the flower die cuts up with a flower on the folder. Then once I have a few of these taped in, you can do as many as you want, I'll run that through my die cut machine in the same way, and this will put that texture, the details of the flower, onto these little die cuts, which will then match with our background perfectly. I really like that embossing folders now often have this option where there's a die that goes with it so that you can get those really textured die cuts. All right, so I finished this card up off screen because it's very basic. I glued my background down onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, and I added a sentiment to the center from the older Concord and 9th Just Say More die set. So the shadow for the Big Hugs sentiment is white cardstock, and the Big Hugs itself is black glossy cardstock. I then scattered some of those silver cherry blossoms around the sentiment using foam circles and added a little white pearl to the center of each. So I really like that fun, colorful, textured background. It's something different, and by using that folder and sanding the surface, I really changed the look of that plaid background. So this is a reminder that if you stamp a background on white cardstock or ink blend on white cardstock, you can use an embossing folder and sand the surface to bring that texture out. Okay, let's move on to our next example using one of those backgrounds. On this one, I added some stamped sentiments to the plaid and turned the front into a shaker card in a really easy way. All right, so I've got my second background here. I've placed back into my stamping tool, and I'm putting that grid placement guide on top. I also have some of the sentiments from that Airy Greetings stamp set. You can see it over there on the left. And I'm lining up some of these sentiments with some of our stamped stripes. Now, the nice thing about the grid here is it's holding those sentiments in place so they don't move around as I start to assemble them. Once I have them assembled where I want, I can close the door on my stamping tool to grab the stamps and remove the grid. Remember, if I wanted to, I could stamp on the grid to make sure I'm happy with my positioning, but I'm just going to wing it here and hope for the best. Now, you could stamp these sentiments with black ink and they would stand out nice and bold against the color. But I wanted something that would be very subtle because I'm going to put a bold sentiment in the center and I'm going to put a shaker window. So I went with Hero Art's Granite ink, which is a nice kind of light to medium color gray. And I'm going to stamp that a few times to make it a bit darker. Keep in mind, this is a dye ink, so it will soften as it dries. So you'll want to stamp it to be a bit darker than the final result that you want. Once I've stamped that on one corner, I can rotate my cardstock and stamp it on the other. Again, if you want this to stand out, you could use black ink, you could silver heat emboss, but I'm going for a subtle gray. All right, so now I'm going to heat set this. The reason I'm heat setting this is sometimes when you layer a crisp dye image on top of a dye ink background, you might get a little bit of bleeding as it softens. So if you heat set it, you kind of set it where it is and you'll keep that crisp result. Now you could leave this background as is and put a bold sentiment in the center, but I thought I'd create a shaker window on it because I was really excited about these new A2 nesting frame dies from Simon Says Stamp. So you can see there are all the sizes included here. The biggest one has an outer dimension of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I also really like the Hello sentiment and shadow die included, and I'll use that a few times in this video. Now, there are a few reasons why I'm excited about these frame dies, and I wanted to explain those first. First of all, they cut frames that are workable. They're not so thin that they'd be hard to add to a card, but they're not so thick that they take up a lot of room and cover a lot of your background. You can use these for shaker windows and much more. The other thing that I'm happy about is sometimes when I have a large rectangle die and I run it through my die cut machine, the outside edges of the die kind of bow a bit and I don't get a perfect rectangle. The outside edges sometimes are arched a bit. These are wider dies, so I can use these frame dies to cut a solid rectangle and then save the frame for later. So this is something you'll see me use a lot in videos. I'm going to use it a few times today, but I definitely will be using it again. So first, let's look at how we can use these A2 frame dies to create a shaker card on the front of this background. So I chose one of the middle size frames and I cut it 3 times from white cardstock, and I'm gluing those together for stacked dimension. The reason I'm stacking several together is this is forming the walls of our shaker window. I then can glue our stacked frame die cuts right at the center of our background. Now you could leave it as is and just have this fun frame on it. It adds a little bit of dimension, creates a focal point, but we're going to turn it into a shaker window. Once that's dry, I can add some shaker bits inside. I'm using some flat, kind of iridescent looking confetti, but you could add whatever you want. If you're adding something in that has more dimension, like little gems, you may want to add more layers of frames onto your stacked die cut just so that it has more dimension. All right, now I'm using tape runner just to add adhesive on the top of my frame. And then onto that, I'm laying a piece of clear acetate. Now this clear acetate piece, I cut to be the same width and height as the outside edge of our frame. So this will cover the entire front of that window. So I'll press that down and then I can finish this off with one more frame die cut on top. This one I cut from silver matte cardstock. You can use liquid adhesive with your acetate. Just keep in mind that it'll take longer to dry. So you're just going to have to give it a little more time to dry, or you can use double-sided tape. By the way, sorry, my head gets in the way, but sometimes you just got to look directly above to make sure you're lining things up nicely. Okay, so we'll give that a bit of time to dry, and then I'm adding a hello sentiment. I use black glossy cardstock for hello, and then white for the shadow behind it. And this will get glued right at the center of our window. And remember that hello die is from that same Nesting Frames die set. So here we have our completed card. I did glue that background onto a top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. You can see our light gray sentiments stamped on the background. Again, you could have made those stand out more if you wanted by using black ink or silver embossing powder. And that shaker window just adds some fun to this, a very different look than our first card, even though we started with the same background. And these frame dies really make it easy to form that shaker window that's nice and strong on the front of our card. Now for our third background, I'm going to do a variation of this shaker card where it's actually a shaker window that allows you to see through to the inside of the card. If you've never done one of these, I'd encourage you to do so because it really makes for kind of a how did they do that effect that the recipient will love. So I have my third background here, and I'll use one of the A2 frame dies to cut right from the center. I'm using the same size frame die as last time. And I'll cut this right from the center. This will give me the outside frame, the thin frame, and then the inside piece. Now the thin frame that I cut, I'm not going to actually use that right now. I can save that for something else. I'm just using the piece in the middle and the outer piece. I'll hold the outer piece on the front of an A2 card, which I have open, and as I have it lined up, I'll pop the frame die into the opening and run that through my die cut machine. That will form a rectangle window in the front of my card that lines up with our frame that will get glued to the front. I also have a piece of acetate that I cut to be slightly smaller than 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm putting adhesive on the top of the frame on the front of our card. I'll lay my acetate on top of it, and then we'll put our decorative frame on top of that. So we're sandwiching the acetate to create a window on the front of our card. Now, I know this is a big window. Don't worry. I'll show you how you can make the card so that there is a place to write a personal message on the inside. I have a top folding note card here, and I'm taking that inside rectangle piece and I'm holding it up in the top left corner. So you can see I'm leaving a little trim there. I'm holding these together, and then I'll use a trimmer to cut the excess of that note card off on the right and the left. Now you could measure and then cut, but I find just holding the piece there while I cut is much faster. Now we can glue that rectangle onto this mini note card, and this mini note card will go inside of our card. That's how we can hide our personal greeting on the inside. So I'll put adhesive on the back of the mini note card. I'm going to open up my card and line this up with the window so that it'll be lined up when we close my card onto it. So the adhesive is facing up. We'll close our card onto it, and now we have the mini note card inside of our note card. And that rectangle on the inside lines up with the frame stamping on the outside. Okay, so you could leave this just as a window card. However, I'm going to turn it into a shaker window. So it's a shaker window that you can completely see through. I have a bunch of white frame die cuts that I created using the same frame die that we used to create the window on our card. On the inside of the window, I'm putting some adhesive and gluing one of those frames just for a finished look. You don't have to do this step, but it'll give us a finished look in the end. Now let's build our shaker window on the front. So I will take maybe four frame die cuts and glue them together for that stacked dimension. And this will form the walls of our shaker window. So this is just like we did before. I'm gluing die cuts together to build that dimension, which will form the walls of our shaker window. Once I have those glued together, stacked together, I can glue them onto the front of the acetate. So now we have a shaker window and we have our shaker walls, so we can fill this up. So I'm filling it again with those flat iridescent little confetti shapes, but you can put whatever you want. And then we will put acetate on top. I'm cutting my acetate piece to be the overall size of that frame, so it matches the outside dimensions of the frame. So I'm filling in my little shaker bits. I will then put some tape runner on the top of our stacked frame die cuts. You could use liquid adhesive, but this is faster at this point. And then I can lay my acetate on top and then finish it off with a silver frame die cut on top of that. So on our last card, we had a shaker window on the front of our card. This time we have a true shaker window that you can absolutely see through, which I think is a really fun technique. To finish it off, I'm using, again, that Hello Greeting that's part of that A2 frame nesting die set, and I'll glue that at the center of our window. I also thought it'd be good to have a stamped sentiment on that mini note card on the inside, so when you open it up, you see that. So I'm using the new Simon Says Stamp You Rock stamp set. There is a coordinating die set that goes with this, but I do like that these sentiments would work well stamped on like a heart or a circle. I chose the You Are Amazing, and I'm laying it on top of the Hello sentiment when my card is closed. So I'm lining it up so that it's right on top of the Hello. I'll close the door on my stamping tool. Now I'll open up my card and stamp this onto the mini card inside. I'll stamp this with black ink. And the reason I lined up that sentiment on the front first is now I know when I stamp this on the inside, it'll be hidden by the Hello sentiment when the card is closed. So here we have our completed card. It's A2 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And you've got that see-through shaker window on the front. And then when you open up the card, you can see the rest of our plaid pattern, our stamped sentiment, and then that opens up for your personal greeting inside of that. So this looks really cool on display because it has that see-through window. And this is something you could do with any inky background that you may make. I thought it was fun to do this with this plaid background because you have all of that fun, bold color and the sparkle there at the center. All right, let's move on to my next 3 cards. I have another set here, all again showing how you can use solid stamps and colorful inks and do some overlapping to create new colors and just get amazing results. Now, the stamp set that I used for this particular set of cards is fantastic. I love it, and it's great for this technique. This is the Simon Says Stamp Pretty Petals stamp set. Now, these layer together very easily. They actually have a code on the stamp set themselves and a guide on the back, but you'll see they're very easy to line up. You can also just use the outline themselves, the outline stamped images, and color those in with watercolor or whatever. I really like kind of the artsy free feel of this stamp set. However, what I'm doing here can be done with a variety of layering stamps, or again, just take different solid shape stamps and overlap them to create your own pattern. To get started, I'm going to share with you a tip on how to do a bunch of stamped and die cut images. This is one of the ways I find most effective when you're doing batch stamping and die cutting. So off screen, I have die cut a bunch of white die cuts using the coordinating die set for the set. I also kept one of the negative pieces, the negative space that has the openings of the die cuts, and I've placed that on a sticky mat inside of my stamping tool. I now can pop die cuts into those openings and line the stamp images up with the die cuts. So in this case, I'm starting with the outline images of the leaves, of the flowers, all the different images included in this set. Sorry, my head gets in the way, but that's the best way to look over the top and make sure I have it lined up. So I placed first the flower, now I'm doing a stem. I'll move on to the next die cut, pop one in the little opening of the negative place, and then line up that stamp image. Once I have all my stamps lined up for all of the die cuts in that negative space opening, we can start our stamping. So I'm going to skip ahead here. I got them all lined up. I have die cuts in all of the openings there, and now I'm stamping with black ink on those die cuts. So I now am able to stamp all of these at once. When I have them stamped, I can take the die cuts out of that negative space and move on to my next set of die cuts. So the reason I find this faster than stamping a bunch and then die cutting them is that I don't have to line up my dies with the stamped images each time. I can just spend a few minutes cutting a bunch of die cuts from white cardstock, just throw it in my die cut machine, cut a bunch of die cuts, and then do the stamping. It's also helpful that I have this negative space in my stamping tool here because I can pop those die cuts in place every time and stamp the additional layers on top of these images. So it's a huge time saver if you're doing a bunch of stamping on die cuts, and especially if you're doing multiple layers on one stamped image. Okay, so I went ahead and stamped the black outline image on all of my white die cuts. I've got a bunch of them up there at the top of the screen. Now let's move on to our first colored layer. So I'm taking the first image from that stamp set and I'm lining it up, and it fits very easily into the outline image lines that I have already stamped. And I'm actually going to do 2 of these at the same time. I could do more, but I'm just doing 2. So I'm lining one up with that bottom right flower and then the top right flower. The others I'll come back to in a bit. Now I am again using the Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively Saturated ink because I really like how these inks overlap and create new colors, but use whatever inks you have. I'm starting with the Sunbeam color. I'm using all the same colors that I used earlier in this video and stamping this onto 3 of each of these size flowers. So I'm going to create 3 cards as I mentioned, so I'm doing 3 different color families. So now I can pop in the next one and stamp that. Now, I did want to mention with this particular stamp set, you could skip the outline and just do the solid images, and it'll give you a completely different look to the flower, but I decided to do both today. So I will continue to stamp a bunch of flowers. I'm doing again 3 different color combos, all using the inks I mentioned before. And this goes by pretty quickly. By doing a batch stamping like this with the negative space and having your die cutting already done, you really save a lot of time. All right, now let's come in with our next image, and this one will overlap with the stamping we've already done. I've also lined up this second image for that top flower. And notice when we stamp this carnation color on top of the sunbeam, we have that new bright orange. So it looks like we've used 3 colors of ink so far, but we've only used 2. And this will continue to build. And look at that beautiful new color. So I will do this with the others. Here I'm overlapping the marine blue color and the carnation, and you can see that beautiful heather color that we get when we overlap. So now that top flower is done, let's move to that middle flower and the additional layers for the big flower on the bottom. Now this time here I'm using the marine, and that marine is overlapping with the yellow to create a green look on that big flower, and that marine is also overlapping with the carnation to give that purple. So that big flower there on the bottom, look at all the colors that have formed on that already, and this is all just by overlapping. So I only used 3 colors, but we have the look of many more. So the whole point of this video and the whole reminder with this video is that you can get more from your inks and stamps by overlapping. And by doing cards like this, where I'm, kind of exploring different colors and how they overlap, I'm able to get to know my inks better and make better use from them. So if you are limited on the colors of inks that you have, remember you can stamp colors on top of each other to get new colors. Here I'm stamping some more blue, and look at that, more green shows up and a darker blue shows up. Such a fun way to get more from your inks. So experiment with your inks. Grab some solid stamps, stamp different colors on top of each other, and see what you get. It's a great way to really stretch your supplies. After completing the flowers, I continued to stamp the solid areas onto the outline leaves. Once I'm done, look at this. I have all of these flowers already stamped and die cut, beautiful colors, and it was a lot of fun to make those. Next, I need to arrange these onto a card. So I have an A2 top folding card, so that's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm adding the flowers with foam tape, and I'm adding the stems by just gluing them directly flat onto my note card. So it'll have varying levels of dimension. Now this is something where I'm trying to fill up the background with my different flowers. So you can see how I'm just kind of moving them around until I'm happy with the position. I'm working on only 1 card first with my first set of flowers and leaves. Once I'm happy with all of the placement, I can flip the card over and trim off all of the excess. You can even use some of those excess pieces that you cut off to fill any little nooks and crannies on the edge of the card where you don't want as much white space. So after I've done this to 1 card, I now have a guide that I can use to follow in creating the other 2 cards. I'll just do the same type of placement for those other 2 cards. And before you know it, you have 3 bold cards with lots of color and dimension. I'm just adding a simple sentiment on top. This is again from the Concord and Ninth Just Say More die set. I created the shadow from white cardstock and the words from black glossy cardstock. You can see I have a bunch of them already die cut and prepped over there on the left of the screen, so I can quickly add them to a card anytime. I think a bold, large sentiment like this is great on these busy backgrounds. So after I've glued on the sentiments, I did add some black gemstones kind of scattered in the white spaces on the background for a bit of sparkle. And then I grabbed matching envelopes. So there you can see the 3 cards that I ended up with. On this particular one, I only used 3 inks on those flowers. I used a pink, a yellow, and a blue. But because of that overlap stamping, you have darker blues, you have greens, you have oranges, and you have purples. So really we're making the most of just a few ink colors. Then on this middle card here, I used pinks, yellows, and a bright watermelon color. And you can see how those overlap to add even more shades in those color families. And then here is our final one. The flowers on this were created with just 2 inks. I used the pink carnation and the blue marine, but you get that overlapping, which gives you those fun shades of purple. Now, before we go, I just wanted to show you some other things that I was kind of playing with, but ran out of time to include in this video. But this is another new stamp set from Simon Says Stamp that would be great for exploring layering different colors. So there are the 3 large images that you can stamp together. They kind of build inside of each other to create that fun little rectangle. You could do a few of these and add them to a card or just use this as the focal point. I wanted to show you on this one. You see how there's 2 shades of blue there? That was actually only 1 blue ink pad. It's the Lake color from Simon Says Stamp Rainbow Splash. The rectangle one I just stamped once or twice. Then those darker flowers, I stamped the same Lake ink pad like 7 or 8 times, making it darker. So it looks like I used 2 shades of blue ink pads, but I only used 1. And then I used the beautiful buttercream to add that yellow. Now, I didn't get to finish off this card because I ran out of time, but I did want to show you that there's another example of building up your inks to get the color you want. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video today. Please remember, I will continue to have edited videos like the one I'm sharing today, traditional videos, but I'm also now doing live videos, and I am offering shortened, edited replays of live videos. So if you don't have the time for a long live, you can watch the shortened version. So be sure to check that out on my channel. I appreciate, again, all the time you spend with me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.